Now I'd like to read with you in the book of Ruth, and we'll read from the beginning. Now, just a bit of a background. This is a historical account of real people and of God's providential interaction with them. Now, the poet William Cowper wrote a poem in which the lines occur, "God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform." And that is certainly the case in this book. From one of the commentators that I've looked at, this is the comment: the book is not primarily about Ruth, Naomi, or Boaz, but about God watching over his people and bringing about what is good. He rules over all and brings blessing to those who trust in him. And sometimes, perhaps more than sometimes, in ways that they would not have chosen or would not have even thought. The Moabites, and Ruth was a Moabitess, were relatives of the Israelites. The Moabites were descended from Lot, the nephew of Abraham. And you know the story of God's judgment on the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, and how Lot was rescued from those towns. And in the aftermath of that, he ended up not by his own choice, but through the manipulations of his daughter, fathering a child by each daughter. And Moab was one of the sons. So the Moabites were close relatives of the Israelites. They weren't friendly to the Israelites. And when the Israelites were making their way to Canaan, Balak, king of Moab, who was terrified by the number of them, hired Balaam, who was a well-known curser of people, successfully so, and he hired him to curse Israel. God would not permit this, and instead Balaam blessed Israel and lost his fee in the process. However, he gave advice, it would seem, to Balak to get the Moabite women to invite the Israelite men to their pagan sacrifices to their own god and to indulge in the revelry, as for their words, which included sexual immorality as part of the worship. And God's judgment fell on his own people. And thereafter, God called them, Israel, to take vengeance on Moab because of what they'd done. And this is what happened. And in the process, Balaam himself was killed. The god of Moab was Chemosh. And like the other gods of these peoples, he was a cruel god. A child sacrifice was part of the worship, on the basis that you gave what mattered most to you to secure the favour of the god. And immorality was also the order of the day. So that gives us an idea where Ruth, the Moabitess, was coming from. That's what she grew up with, and that is what she would have been part of. But early on, she came to know an Israelite family. Boaz himself, who figures in the story, he apparently would have been a contemporary of Gideon. And they both lived in the time of the Judges, which was a bit anarchic. There was no king, there was no central authority. And the refrain at the end of the book of Judges is, in those days Israel had no king, everyone did as they saw fit. And what they saw fit wasn't always anything that was good. So let's read now in chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Naomi means pleasant, Mara means bitter. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me, and the Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Well, we'll look at that after we sing again to God's praise. Then I want to look through the rest of the book. Well, to come back to Ruth and Naomi, having spent time in the land of Moab, Naomi and family did not succumb to worshipping the god of Moab. She and her family kept faithful to the Lord, the God of Israel, the true and the living God. And in the course of the history of her family, and particularly of her sons and her daughters-in-law, obviously her faithfulness to the God of Israel made an impression, probably on both of them, but certainly it made a very deep impression on Ruth. And through hearing about the God of Israel from her in-laws, Ruth came to want to belong to the God of Israel. And she chose the God of Israel for herself. And that is why when it came to the time of parting, she said she wouldn't go back to her people, to her gods, but she would go with Naomi to her people, and Naomi's God would be her God. And this was a thorough change of understanding, of outlook, of belief. God had been at work in Ruth's life and brought Ruth to be one of his own people. Now, the implications of this, Ruth had no idea of, nor indeed anyone else. But it just so happened, and God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform, that the man whom she would eventually marry in Israel had a mother who had also been a pagan. Rahab, the harlot, the prostitute of Jericho, who alone of all her people had come to understand that the God of Israel was the true God and wanted to belong to him. And when it came to Joshua's spies coming into Jericho and being in danger of being discovered, you remember she hid them on the rooftop of her house and then let them down from her house on the wall and advised them to go and hide before they tried to make their way back across the Jordan to the main body of the Israelites. And made them promise that when Israel conquered Jericho and destroyed the people of it, as she knew would happen, that they would spare her and her family. And she married an Israelite, a man called Salmon. And we see that at the end of the chapter. So here was a repeat of the same thing. God at work to bring somebody who was not one of his people to come to know him, to trust him. And as Boaz said to her later on in the next chapter, he said, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done," that is for Naomi, "and may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, and at whose wings you have come to take refuge." Naomi was utterly despondent. And you can understand that. She'd gone away with a husband and 2 sons to the land of Moab. Her husband had died, the 2 sons had married, and then the 2 sons had died. So she had no one. And in those days, as in many other places in the world today, if you want security in your old age, then you need children, maybe particularly sons. So she was there, a foreigner in a foreign country, bereft of support. But she had heard that there was no longer famine in Judah, and she was returning home again. But she had a very, very negative outlook on life, and she thought God was very much against her. That's what she said to her 2 daughters-in-law. She said in verse 13, "Life is more bitter for me than for you." They'd lost their husbands and their support, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Now, they could go back to their own people. They were obviously young widows. They could find, most likely, husbands again, and could have that support in that way and bring up families. But Naomi was too old for that. What she says about having sons and would they wait till the sons had grown up, this was the idea of the kinsman, the near relative. In the law of Moses, it was particularly a brother of the deceased. And if a man died, leaving his widow childless, his brother had the duty to marry the widow so that she could have a son who could inherit her late husband's property, so that his line would not die out. And all the rest of the sons that she and her new husband would have, the late husband's brother, would be theirs. But the first would be like the son of the deceased. And that was the idea. And so Naomi was saying to him, look, if I were going to have sons, supposing I got married and got pregnant and had a son tonight, are you going to wait years and years and years until they're old enough to act the brother's part to the deceased? He said, no, that's just a total impossibility. You've got no future with me. It's not that she didn't love them, it's not that she didn't want them and appreciate them, but there wasn't a future for them. They would be foreign girls in Israel. Their chances of getting married there would probably be not very good. And so, materially, they were better off back home with their own mothers and families and with the prospects of having another husband. But Ruth had made up her mind that she would stay with Naomi because she too had come to worship, to know, to love, and wanted to live according to what the God of Israel wanted. And when Naomi and Ruth then came back to Israel, to Bethlehem, I think there must have been quite a dramatic change in her looks, physically, because the woman said, "Can this be Naomi? Is it really her?" They thought it was, but there was things there that she was different. And Naomi again said, "You know, the Lord's hand is against me. He's afflicted me. He's brought misfortune upon me." So things didn't look good at all. She had no son. She had no one to look after her in her old age. She was sort of forgetting about Ruth, but it was a son that she was focused on, and she didn't have one. So everything and the future was black. When they arrived in Bethlehem, it was time for the barley harvest. And we might say, well, what a coincidence. Well, there are coincidences that are not really luck. God is a God of providence, of the ins and outs of life, and this was one of them. But neither Ruth nor Naomi was aware of that. Barley harvest was the first harvest, then after that came the wheat harvest. So we come to chapter 2. And in the first verse there, we're told something that wasn't in Naomi's mind. It had enormous implications. So we're getting a wee bit of a foretaste of how things might work out. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So this is the first we hear of Boaz. This is not the same thing as the brother who is to marry the widow and raise a son up for the deceased, who will inherit the land that belonged to the deceased brother. This is a slightly, well, more than slightly, it's a different thing. The nearest relative to someone who had had to sell their property in order to live, had the right to buy that back for the person, to redeem what had been sold. If a person who had to sell that managed to prosper enough to get the price for it, then they themselves could redeem it. But there's this idea here of the kinsman redeemer, the near relative redeemer. And there's a Hebrew word for it, the goel. When you sold something in Israel, it never belonged to the buyer. A field belonged to the person who received it down through his family from God. What the buyer bought was the use of the field until the year when all such fields returned to their original owners in the year of Jubilee. So if the year of Jubilee was far away, it cost you a lot to buy the field, and if it was just round the corner, you didn't pay very much. But you only had it for a specific time. But during that time, it could be bought back by the person or by the kinsman redeemer. Verse 2, and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And actually, literally, it is her chance to hit upon the field that belonged to Boaz. A shot in the dark. What a lucky happening. Except that's not what it was. God was at work, his wonders to perform. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, he said. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? Bethlehem wouldn't have been very big. And so he would know everybody in Bethlehem. But he didn't know this girl. The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. That was to stop her receiving unwelcome attention, or even just not to be told, you're working far too close to us, get away back. And the water was something special too. Otherwise she would have had to have gone and drawn her own water. And so Boaz was concerned for this stranger. He knew about Naomi. He knew about her, as we're going to see in a moment. And he was concerned to do the very best for her. Now, if you're thinking there might be some romantic stirrings here, you could be right. Who knows? In the end, obviously, we'll come to that. So Boaz, right. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So he esteemed her. He realized that she was a lady, a young woman of quality. Now, to go and live as a stranger in a strange place is not easy. And even in our own country, if anyone from Fort William, let's say, marries somebody from the North Coast, let's say Betty Hill, since we lived there for a while near it, you'll forever be an incomer. Your son or daughter might be a native. I'm not quite sure even of that. But that's the way it was. That's the way it is even today. So there was a lot to Ruth. And then Ruth says, "May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my Lord. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I have not the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." Then she sat down with the harvesters. He offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. Now an ephah turns out to be 4 gallons. So you can imagine, if you have worked with corn or that and bound sheaves, how much it would take to make 4 gallons of grain. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today," she said, "is Boaz." "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative, our Goel. He is one of our that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." That's the Goel. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. They came back to Bethlehem just at the right time, so that Ruth could work by gleaning when the harvest was being reaped, and so support herself and her mother-in-law. They didn't have anyone else there, no family, close family, to help them. And it just so happened that the field that Ruth went to belonged to this man, Boaz. This is one of the strange things in life. One thing that puzzled Solomon. He couldn't understand how a ship could navigate on the open seas. He couldn't understand how a serpent could slither across the rock. It doesn't have any feet. And he couldn't understand, he said, the way of a man with a maid. Now, I suppose all of us who are married or have been married understand how these things happen. They happen when you're not expecting it and not intending it. You meet someone and you're drawn to them. It might be a bit of hard work before you get them to say yes. But this is the way life is. So, this Moabitess young woman, widow, arriving there in Bethlehem, happened to work in the field of this man Boaz, who, by the way, was older, as we'll see. And whether the spark was kindled at the first meeting, who knows? But there was definitely a mutual interest there. Coming to chapter 3. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you." What she said was, "I must find rest for you." And she said to Orpah and Ruth as they were leaving Moab, "I must find rest. You should go back home and find rest with another husband." So this is what Naomi had in mind. "I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying down, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer, or a kinsman redeemer of our family." It may seem a strange way to go about it, but that was the custom. And indeed, in the book of Ezekiel, there's in chapter 16 there at verse 8, it's a chapter about God finding Israel as an infant that has just been born, and she's been thrown out. It's still unwashed in her own blood and wallowing away. And he passes along and he says to her, "Live." He looks after her until she's old enough for marriage. And these are God's words through Ezekiel about Israel. "I passed by and looked on you, and behold, your time was the time of love." She was immature. "And I spread my skirt over you and covered your nakedness. And I swore to you and entered into a covenant with you, says the Lord Jehovah, and you became mine." Now Ezekiel was a long time after Boaz, but this was the custom, and apparently it was, I don't know how recently, a custom amongst the Arabs. This was the way that you showed that you were taking this particular woman to be your wife. The threshing floor was somewhere, usually on a hilltop where the wind blew, and you would have the grain trodden by the animals, or have a threshing sledge pass over it, and the husk, the chaff, would be separated from the grain itself, and you threw up the grain in the air, and the wind blew the chaff away, and the grain fell back down. When we were in Peru, it's a long time ago now, but it's not hundreds of years, I came across a man putting his horses round a threshing floor out in the country in the mountains. This is exactly what Boaz would have done. And in Moyobamba, in the high jungle, there was a family who were winnowing probably rice, but instead of a wind, they flapped a blanket at it to make a wind to blow the chaff away. So that's what was happening here. And Boaz went there to guard his grain against anybody who might want to steal it. That's why he slept on the threshing floor. So she went, she lay down at his feet, and then he woke up and there was this woman there. So he wondered what on earth was going on. So Ruth explained why she was there and what she was wanting. That as the nearest relative, he would take her as his wife to raise up a son to her late husband and redeem the property, the field that Naomi had to sell probably before she went to Moab, or Elimelech better had to sell. And this was Boaz's response. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here till morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." Now, I think it's obvious from this that Boaz was very keen to do the duty of the kinsman redeemer because of his esteem for Ruth. And I think it's quite reasonable and normal and natural to say because of his love for Ruth, his desire to do the best for her, and also because of his personal interest in her. Love in both these terms. And Ruth, one could say she was following the custom and doing the right thing. But I think there was more than that. She was doing it because she wanted to. She could have looked for a younger man to marry, but she chose to do this, both because this was God's way in Israel in these circumstances, and obviously she appreciated the kind of man that Boaz was. His kindness, his concern, and his love. Why did he say to her, "Stay here for the night"? Now people may think, well, they were going to have sex together. But no, neither of them was that kind of person. And besides, that wasn't God's way. That was to wait for marriage and to be engaged in that beforehand. It would have been wrong and sinful. I think it's quite reasonable to say that he didn't want her to be wandering in the dark through the village. It was the time of the judges, there were plenty bad people around. So this was to protect her from harm. And why did he say to her then, when they got up early before anyone could be recognised, and sent her back then? Well, he didn't obviously want people gossiping and nudging and saying things about them both that weren't true. Then he said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." Now, a shawl is not a very robust kind of thing, at least in our terminology. So it must have been something heavier, because it's possible that he put 40 kilos worth of grain in it. It was 6 measures of barley that he poured into her mantle or her blanket. Women in various countries have a sort of a blanket thing that they carry things on their back. Babies shopping, put it over their heads as well. It would be something like that. And it must have been fairly heavy, because we read he placed the bundle on her. So he would have helped her, and possibly she carried it on her head, that being the way of these things, and still in many places. And then she went back to town. He went back to town. Verse 16, when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything that Boaz had done for her, and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." And so we read in chapter 4, "Meanwhile Boaz went up to the town gate and sat down there just as the guardian redeemer he had mentioned came along." And the town gate was the place where business was done, legal business, and this was a legal matter. He got the elders together, as we'll see, and he got the man, the nearer kinsman, to come over. "Come over here, my friend, and sit down," Boaz said. So he went over and sat down. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the guardian redeemer, kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. And if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." Now notice how careful and honest and unmanipulative that Boaz was. He gave him the opportunity straightforwardly, and the man said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead man with his property." At this the guardian redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." So why do you think he said that? Well, we don't know for sure, but perhaps the man was married with children, or hoped to have children, and he didn't want his own line and inheritance to be interfered with by someone else's child. It could be the expense of it. If he bought the field, yes, he could profit from what would grow in it. If he had to marry Ruth and raise a son for her late husband, he wouldn't see very much of his purchase price. So it may have been something like that. And so they went through the legal ritual for the transfer of property. Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. Now, we're not much better than solicitors. So the guardian redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself." And he removed his sandal. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the profit of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses." Then the elders and all the people at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah." So 12 children minimum, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel." And this would refer to the child that Ruth would have. "He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." So the child was Naomi's now, to replace her dead son. So now she had a future in Israel, and there would be descendants, as we'll see from this child. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. When she left Moab and came back to Israel, "The Lord is against me. Life was bitter. I've lost everything. I've got no future, no hope." And now she has a future and a hope because of this son. And all because of God's working things out for the good of those who trusted in him. It's a true story. It's a lovely story. But there's more to it than that. When we read the genealogy there, Perez was the father of Hezron, etc. Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. There are people missing in the genealogy. A genealogy that says so-and-so begat so-and-so doesn't necessarily mean his actual son. It could mean a grandson. That's recognized to be quite normal. But Boaz was Rahab's son, so David may have been Rahab's great grandson. It might have been a wee bit further down the line. But when we come to the genealogy of Jesus in the New Testament and Matthew's Gospel at the very beginning, we find Rahab, we find Ruth, we find Boaz, we find Jesse, we find David. And the most interesting thing about it all, which isn't mentioned in the book, is that Jesus, the Son of God, is our Goel, our kinsman redeemer. Because there was nobody in the human race capable of doing what was necessary to redeem us from sin and death and lostness and bring us back to God. God, the eternal Son himself, became a member of the human race, a real man, a sinless man, a man tempted and tested in every way in which we are, but who did not sin, and so was the perfect man who could stand in for us. And that is the way that God dealt with his just wrath against us. He dealt with it in pouring it out in his Son, so that through faith in him we might be reconciled to God, we might be redeemed. And the last thing, Job, in all his troubles and trials, had said, "Oh, that there was a man who could lay his hand upon us both, to be a go-between between God and me, us." And that is exactly who Jesus is, the God-man, Redeemer, and our Goel. And his name, in Matthew's Gospel, where we're told that Joseph was told to call his name Jesus, which means God saves, we're also told that he was to be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Let's pray. We thank you, O Lord, for your word. And we thank you that you do work in mysterious ways, your wonders to perform. And we thank you for that. And we thank you too that we have that kinsman redeemer, your own eternal Son who became man, who can lay his hand upon us both. Bless us then in the understanding and in the acceptance of your love and grace in Jesus Christ. For we ask it in his name. Amen.